Well, Joe and Jamie have been with us for a few years now. This is probably the moment they haven't been looking forward to. So, um, things you need to know is that Joe's the bad guy, Jamie's a good guy in this story. That helps a lot, doesn't it? So, no, that's not true. There's lots of blame to point everywhere. But Joe had opportunity. They're going to share with you, but had opportunity to go through a rehabilitation process, and God was all over that. What we want you to catch out of their story is not just the gory details. I mean, that adds interest to it. They had to live it, and it wasn't fun for them. But we want you to catch the power of God and what he can do in changing a life, and how marvelous it is. I tell people all the time, other pastor friends and stuff, that we have this couple, Joe and Jamie, and they're the best story in our church. And in many ways they are. But hopefully God will not take you through the things that they've gone through. Hopefully he'll just allow you to experience his grace. So Joe and Jamie, is there any way we can make you more comfortable? Chairs, something to drink, or okay, I can't help the audience, but I can try you at least. So thank you so much for sharing this.
Okay. This is our story of the struggles of addiction from the addict and the family. And addiction has many factors, some of these including biology, development, and environment. And drug addiction is not discriminatory. We're willing to share our story in hopes that it helps reach others and glorifies God. A couple of things that we would like you to know is that our family struggled through this with us. And throughout this process, they struggled throughout the process with us. And we don't mind if you share our story to help others.
Me and Jamie were both raised in religious homes. We were both taught the love of Christ at a young age. And that did help us through all this. I started using drugs at a young age. About age 13, I was experimenting with weed and alcohol. And as I got older and got more independence, age 16, you get your driver's license, started doing more. I stayed away from home as much as I could. And the day after I graduated, I actually moved up here. I grew up in southern Ohio. When I moved, I was experiencing independence at a young age, and things just kept going wrong. And my fault, but the way to fix that is I would either change jobs, change people that I was surrounded with, and then change locations. And that's a common thing among addicts is if you move somewhere, you can start fresh. Problem is, no matter where you're at, there you are. By age 20, I had moved to Virginia and pretty much bounced around about 5 different states there. And age 26, I ended up getting a DUI, which was the first time that I faced real legal repercussions. In order to serve a house arrest instead of going to jail, I had to have an address here in Wayne County. So I moved back to Rittman. And I served that time, and that is when me and Jamie started dating.
Shortly after we got married, and I knew that Joe smoked weed, and we would both drink occasionally together, but I didn't know about the other drugs. Joe was on probation, and he told me he was meeting with his probation officer, so I thought things were on the up and up.
I did meet with my probation officer probably twice, and anybody that's familiar with that knows that's not a good idea. And that was just one of the many things that I lied to her about. And we were getting married, and she had no idea what I was doing. That first year of marriage was rough. She would catch me watching pornography. I would try and hide it. I would steal money from the family, from the accounts. I was skimming paychecks. I wouldn't let her ever see how much I actually made. When you are addicted to something, regardless if it's drugs or anything, you are completely and totally self-centered. And that's all I lived for, was where I was getting the next fix. I wasn't real picky. I did anything as long as I wasn't feeling emotion. In September of 2009, we would have been married 2 years at that point, I had a knee surgery, which with it came Percocet. And so now not only would I have drugs, I was getting off the street, I was getting drugs legally. And the doctors just kept giving me prescriptions. I'd go through a month's worth in like 2 days. I'd sell the stuff to get stronger stuff, and I was spiraling.
In Thanksgiving of that year, we were driving to visit his family in southern Ohio, and Joe told me he wasn't feeling well and that I needed to take him to the ER. And we went to the closest emergency room. It was about an hour away from his mom and dad's, and his mom and dad came and picked up the kids, so it was just the two of us there. And the ER doctor brought in Joe's prescription list, and it was very lengthy, and I was unaware of these things. So Joe denied these prescriptions being his and said that somebody else must be writing out prescriptions for him. That night we went to his mom and dad's, and Joe still didn't have access to the drugs that he needed, so he actually threw himself down their steps so that an ambulance would have to come and take him to the hospital because that would get him pain medication. So we get to that hospital, and I'm telling this emergency room doctor, well, it's not my husband. I completely believe him. Somebody has wrote prescriptions for him, and they ended up giving him pain medication, and Joe was comfortable. So when we got home, I called the pharmacies where these prescriptions had been filled and said, print out the signatures for me, and went to get them. And that's when Joe finally admitted that those were all his prescriptions. He had taken them all as quickly as he possibly could. And at that point, realizing just some of the lies, I had kicked Joe out, and he went with a buddy and began AA. And from this point, Joe escalated quickly, and I began going to Al-Anon with a friend. And Al-Anon was wonderful in helping me realize that Joe's choices had nothing to do with me, and I couldn't help him become better. I learned the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. During this time, because of our religious upbringing, we were attending church, but often Joe found things that he didn't like in each of the churches that we were attending.
AA had helped me piece together short periods of sobriety. I did quit using narcotics at that time, but I was binge drinking. I would be sober for a couple weeks, and then if I took one drink, I would just drink till I blacked out. So at this time that I started feeling suicidal, which was it's a byproduct of not experiencing emotions. I'd never learned to cope, so I always had a drug, and then when the drugs were gone, I didn't know what to do, so I thought I was suicidal. So ended up in a psych ward, and when you'd go to a psych ward, they'd throw something at you, see if this works, and if it didn't work, they'd ask something else.
It was during this time that we actually started attending Rittman Grace. And if Joe wouldn't answer his phone when I would call home, I was in an immediate panic. Had he successfully committed suicide? What was I driving home to? Are my kids going to see him in my front yard? Was he back in the hospital? And if he was, it was always a mandatory 72 hours, and I wouldn't get a phone call for probably the first 5 hours that he was there. So there was always a gap in time, and my head took me to places not that I wasn't sure of, because we were living in a crisis mode. I learned from Al-Anon at that point that if Joe were successful in committing suicide, that there was nothing that I could have done to change it. It wasn't in my power, it was his choice. There was times that Rittman police would find Joe wandering the streets, and he would end up in a psych ward unit. I was seeing a counselor at the time, and she felt that I needed to leave Joe, and every time I brought up my faith, she said it does help some people, but I could always meditate on it. So shortly through all of this, Trent ended up finding Joe in our driveway having a seizure. and came running into the house, and we ended up calling the emergency room. And this is where seizure medication started on top of the antipsychotic medications.
Jamie had to keep all my medication locked up because I would just take it all to see what would happen. I was not a reasonable person, and anything to have a buzz, I would try. So I had a seizure. I'm pretty convinced that it was because I was taking so many drugs without any regard for my well-being, and I ended up having to go to Cleveland Clinic for a brain study, which they're trying to figure out why I'm having these seizures. I'm not telling them that I'm eating pills like Skittles, and so it was a useless endeavor. I'd probably been in the psych ward, we'll say anywhere from 5 to 10 times, and they finally said, you can't go home. You got to do aftercare of some sort. So I ended up in a psych hospital in Cambridge for a month. When I was released, Jamie didn't take me back. I ended up staying with another guy I had met, and I'd be at his house for a couple weeks. I'd talk my way back into our house. I'd mess up and do something else, and then she'd kick me out again.
It was during this time that I was going through some of the writings that Joe had from the psychiatric hospital that he was in, and I had found out that he had had an affair earlier that year. So I called a divorce lawyer and set up an appointment, and Joe had been staying at a friend's house at that time. So I called him to come over to our house to talk.
The same day, I had woke up. Throughout this process, I had actually held a job, no effort of my own, but they were letting me work there. And he had finally called earlier that week and said, don't come back until things get better. And so I woke up. Nobody was in the apartment with me. I had had all my medicine because since I wasn't living there, she wasn't monitoring it. And I knew what drugs did what to me. And so I took the one that would make me sleep. 3 of them would knock me out, and I ended up taking a whole bottle. It was the first time I did something. Every other time I had thought of suicide, I was scared. I didn't want to do it. I didn't know what I was feeling. And this was the first time when I consciously stood up, did it, and was fine. I wasn't scared.
He came to the house, and I confronted him about the affair, and he denied it. And I explained to him I was meeting with the divorce lawyer, and I was done with our marriage. And after a lot of denying, Joe did admit to it. And he was falling in and out of sleep during our conversation, which made me really upset. But I was used to seeing Joe look like a zombie. When you're on antipsychotics, you end up with this glazed over look in your face, or at least the way Joe was. And so I was kind of used to that, but the falling in and out of sleep while we were talking was a little abnormal. So Joe began crying and explained that he took the entire bottle of medication and asked me to take him to the hospital. And at the hospital, they readmitted him to the psych ward.
That would have been December of 2011. When they were suggesting aftercare again. And I had started talking to a guy I knew, and he'd actually visited the refuge, I think, 10 years prior. He actually knew about it as a faith-based ministry for men on drugs, and he suggested it to me, and then him and Jamie took me down there. Every Tuesday, there was an interview process where you'd watch the orientation video, and then they'd interview, and if it worked for you or seemed like a good fit for you, you would be taken that day. We went down on a Tuesday, and I watched the video. It was like an hour-long thing, and then you get lunch, and then there's an interview. And in this interview, it was kind of interesting. When you deal with counselors and when you live in that kind of lifestyle, you end up answering the same questions a lot. Well, I'm going through this interview with a guy named Pastor Brian, and he's this older black guy who was kind of rough, but he really did love us. He just didn't put up with much. And so one of the questions he asked me was, why is the refuge right for you? Why would you want to come to the refuge? And if I had been honest, I'd have been like, I'm homeless and there's nowhere else to go. But instead, I said, I wanted to draw closer to God. And he kind of laughed, and he's like, the funny thing is, God's always been in the same place. Where were you? And that really set me back. Kind of shut me up. But they wouldn't let me in that day because of the amount of medication I was on. So I ended up coming back with Jamie, having to tell her that they aren't admitting me, and she drove me back up here. I was able to meet with the doctor. If I had a signed release from the doctor, they'd let me go. So we went to our family doctor the next morning, and I told him what I was thinking and doing, and he was not thrilled that I was stopping, like, anti-seizure medicine and stuff, but at the same time, nothing else had worked, so he just pretty much let us go. The next morning, she ended up driving me back down, which had to be to Lancaster instead of Columbus, which was an extra hour.
As I dropped off Joe, the refuge is a 13-month program for just men. And I wasn't happy with where our marriage was at, but I was also dropping off my husband for over a year. And I was crying and praying after I dropped him off. And as I cried, I looked up and I saw a sign that said New Hope. And it was for a church. But I knew God was talking to me. So I drove a little further and I started crying and praying some more because this is a very overwhelming process. And as I continued to cry and pray, I looked up and saw a sign that said Expect Change. It was a huge white billboard with black lettering. And I felt a sense of relief because I knew that God was guiding me through this process.
The refuge is set up in 3 phases. The first phase is like 4 to 6 weeks, and you're isolated. There's no outside contact with family or friends. It was basically set up so guys could dry out and kind of let the fog clear. It's very structured, strong emphasis on physical fitness, and we were introduced to curriculum and a meditation schedule of sorts. We read out of the 1-year Bible every morning. Phase 2. Do I do all the phases now?
No.
Okay. That's phase 1.
During this time, I was very stressed, and I was just trying to make it day by day. I knew that I could pay our bills, but the biggest concern for me was our rent. The place where Joe worked, we were actually renting the house that we were living in from them, and it was automatically taken out of his pay, and he was gone. So I wasn't sure how I was going to handle raising 3 children on my own and paying rent. And through prayer and just the outreach of the love and the support of people, that in that first 4 weeks, 6 weeks that Joe was gone, our rent was paid for the entire 13 months that Joe would be gone. In one letter I had wrote to Joe telling him that somebody had mailed me a $200 gift card to the grocery store. And just the amount of encouragement that I was given through this process was amazing. I would show up to my classroom door, and there would be groceries sitting next to my door. And people were just there for us in unbelievable ways.
After phase 1, you then are transferred to phase 2. And phase 2 is a farm in Vinton County, which is southeastern Ohio-ish. It's in the middle of nowhere. But it's a place where you're granted a little more freedom, you're granted contact with the outside world some, and a little more emphasis on love and learning and less on the discipline. And I was able to talk to Jamie. Well, the way everything works at the refuge is every Tuesday you'd be in Columbus to pick up the new guys that were coming in. And then that's when you also did your transitions through the phases. And for some reason, we ended up going to Columbus, driving back to Lancaster, and then driving to Vinton County, which put us 7 guys that were transferring that day into the farm like at 10 o'clock, and which was odd. And then we go out back, and the second phase pastor was much more pastorish. I mean, I was going from a Marine drill instructor who spent 17 years in prison to this guy who was just kind of short and pudgy and happy. And he takes us out back, and we're doing this great big prayer circle, and he's like, what's your biggest concern? What do you guys want to get out of the farm? And it came to me, and I'm like, my wife is home with 3 kids. I'm not there. The one thing I did occasionally was show up with some money, and she has, I didn't know what to do. Well, the next morning I called her, and that's when she told me about rent was paid. And it was overwhelming in the fact that much was given to us at that point, and it also eliminated any need for me, which was a good thing. I didn't have to come home. There was no reason for me to be there. So I ended up staying. While you're at the farm, you would spend 1 week at the farm doing more curriculum. You're learning more. It's a much more spiritual place. And then you'd spend a week there, and then you'd spend the next week in Columbus where you're working for a temp agency. That's how the refuge makes their money. But it also introduces you back into the workplace. You're working with real people. And we're on construction crews, and you're going to be faced with things as you're going through life. This is also when me and Jamie were able to talk once a week, and we were able to write letters. As many letters as we were possible. She wrote a lot more than me. And I started to learn this wasn't all about me. Phase 1, I was still concerned about where I was, what I was doing, how bad I felt, and it's sad, but I really wasn't thinking too much about home. And then when you're getting letters from her every day, explaining what's going on with the kids, I've basically missed all of Isaiah, or number 3, up to this point. I missed his whole baby, his whole first year I wasn't there. And you learn to care about others, which is bizarre, but at age 26, that's what I was learning. 27. This also was when I started to feel the word speak to me. I mean, you would read things, and you were getting letters from people, and people were telling you what verses worked, and this is what I read in this time. And then me and her would be reading, and she'd tell me what she read that morning. I'd tell her it was in the 1 year, and it was really starting to speak.
Once a month on Sundays, there was a family day, and you could actually see your loved one. And visitation was from 11 to 4. And we lived 3.5 hours away. So I would pack up my 3 kids. We'd be on the road by 7 in the morning, and we'd get back very late on a Sunday evening. And it was extremely stressful. The majority of our communication was through letters because we could only have one 20-minute conversation on Sundays. That's the only amount of time that we were allowed to talk. It was during this time that I ended up canceling my appointment with my divorce lawyer. I didn't feel God was telling me to leave my marriage, but I can also say that I didn't have a strong feeling that I was supposed to stay either. So I didn't want to be divorced. And I canceled that appointment and figured I would just see what continued to happen in our lives. I also switched to a Christian counselor who was much more supportive of our marriage. We were both actively seeking God's word in our lives during this time. And it was at this point in our lives that we both feel that we fully accepted God into our hearts. It wasn't quite a salvation moment. It was a salvation experience through this time.
After phase 2, I ended up moving. Phase 3, you live in Columbus full time. And the way it was set up was we had 3 houses, and there's, I think, 7 guys to a house. And you're basically living your life. You go to work every day. We do outreach in the evenings. We still did curriculum. We still did different things. Small groups were big. That's when we started doing our small groups. You would get the guys together every Monday night, and we'd kind of go over what was going on in each other's lives. And you learn to live life. You've got some money, not very much, but there's some money that you need to manage. You're still going to work every day, and you're still staying clean. You're not allowed to use. And the goal of phase 3 is basically to get you back into society. And the way the temp agency is set up, if you're living in Columbus, you can generally get a job with one of these employers. I was able to call home daily at this point. So now I'm going from getting letters and learning about things 3 to 5 days later than they happen to catching her after bedtime and learning about what she did throughout the day and how much she was doing. I mean, she was doing It was good to hear. It was hard to hear. You didn't know what to do. I felt that I should still be in Columbus, for everything was working up to this point, yet it's hard to listen to your wife just go crazy because there's too much to get done. At this point, we were able to actually start rebuilding our marriage. Like, it was decided that we were going to stay married. And I was able to meet with I found a counselor who had actually been through the refuge a few years prior. He's a licensed counselor, and he worked with the married couples that were coming through. And me and her started meeting with him. We started going over a lot. We had to deal with a lot, and we continued to move forward.
Driving to Columbus, when he moved to phase 3, he was allowed to come home 3 weekends a month, but it was my job to drive to Columbus and get him and bring him home on Friday nights, and then drive him back to Columbus on Sunday evenings and come home. And that was a lot to do 3 weekends a month. A lot of driving. A lot of times I would have my parents watch the kids because I didn't want them sitting in the car for 4 to 5 hours, depending on what we were doing. And then when we started seeing the counselor, we'd be down there late Friday evenings. After a few months that he was in phase 3, he ended up being able to take his car to Columbus and drive himself back and forth, which really helped alleviate some of my stress of driving, but it was still my job to pay for it.
During phase 3, the pastor that oversaw phase 3 was, he also owned a concrete finishing company, which I had a little experience in, and I had a driver's license. So I was able to work with him daily, kind of apart from the other guys, which was nice because I was able to talk with him on a much more personal level. He was not an addict, which was the first one I had in the refuge that wasn't an addict, and he had a real marriage, and he had lived a normal life, more or less. And he was able to reveal to me, like, this is what marriage is. This is what you need to be doing for your wife. And I was able to learn so much from that. And we, again, being able to talk daily, I could come home and actually tell Jamie what we were talking about and where we were. And I think she was starting to realize that I wasn't just trying to get out of where I was.
As we continued in counseling, we worked toward what our marriage and home would be like when Joe came home and completed the program. I was very stressed throughout this process. I was also working on my master's this entire time and working a full-time job and raising 3 kids and just holding the full financial responsibility of our household and then paying for Joe's traveling expenses on the weekends.
After much prayer and meditation and talking with Pastor Bill, it was decided it was best for me to come home. I wasn't going to stay in Columbus, and I had already been there 10 months, so we decided it would just be easier if I went home and started reestablishing my life here. And coming back was an adjustment, but it was so easy, too. I mean, things were laid in front of us that would have been impossible in any other situation. Recovery is impossible without God, and you won't find a program that doesn't say that. And the refuge was placed in front of us at a time that was perfect, obviously. And it gave me knowledge to how to overcome addiction through knowing of God and His Word. And it taught me how to handle life sober.
We hope that our story shows you how God supported us through this entire process. He helped us through our struggles, through Joe's suicide attempts. He guided me to know that there was hope and supported us financially and led us both through His Word. He rebuilt a family, and God carried us through. Our marriage is not perfect, but God showed us a way through a very difficult time without giving up, and we have been greatly blessed. The struggle that we went through was worth the marriage that we have now.
This Pastor Bud came to us a few months ago with this idea of us sharing our testimony, which we have done in bits and pieces meeting with people, but I don't think we obviously never sat down together and went through it. And it's kind of ridiculous, the amount of God's influence and everything. That me and her never realized that morning that I'd ate all those pills. It never struck us that had she not called me, I hadn't woke up and answered the phone, I would probably be dead on that apartment floor. I sleep through her phone calls all the time. But it's little things, not little, but things like that throughout the whole. We are so in God's hand the entire time. And it's so humbling to know that this is where we are and where we could go from here. It's just amazing. My favorite verse through this whole thing I found was Isaiah 40:31. But they who wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. And they shall walk and not faint.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hope you understand how that probably was not an easy thing to get up here and do. I remember the Sunday morning when Jamie came to me and told me that Joe had entered a rehabilitation center. I was shocked because I thought they were the perfect couple back then, and they were just so cool, and which kind of illustrates the fact of how easy it is for anybody to fool everybody else, but you don't fool Christ, and you can't do that. God knows our hearts, and as Joe was sharing about, the fact that God had done big things at little moments for them, it really is a reminder. There's many, many Bible verses that say things like, God is the ever-present help in our time of need. Even when you don't understand it or don't see it, he is always there. And as the pastor said, where you been? God's always been there, Joe. And I think I have some stats in the bulletin for you, and you can look at that stuff and some resources. But it is true that about 80 or 90% of the people who have had dependencies of this type that rehab and come through well attributed to spiritual disciplines and practice, that God was there and in their lives. And I've heard some of our secular rehabilitation centers tell us that they have an 18% success rate. That's not a good rate. Now, lest we condemn them, the refuge, which I would highly endorse, gotten to know Mr. Thompson down there a little bit, and just great godly people. Their success rate is somewhere around 38 or 40%, which is a whole lot better than 18, but you're still losing 2 out of every 3 people. That's not good. But it shows you the incredible pull that some of these chemicals have on the individuals, and not everyone makes it. I'm learning a lot more about that, and that's not something I always wanted to know. But I am so thrilled that in Jesus Christ, lives can be transformed. And I still think that Joe and Jamie are perfect today, but they just told us they're not. I'm shocked again. And Jamie, it is true that you probably wrote a whole lot more letters to Joe than he wrote to you, because I wrote a couple that he never answered either. So that's okay, I guess. But what we want to be sure, I mentioned earlier that you caught the fact, not just all the details, but God has details for everybody. All your lives are stories as well. But catch the fact that God is a part of it, and that Christ wants to transform you as well. Their story's not over. They've got a long ways to go and a lot more to do, but they're doing great. And they really are a great couple and a great family, and we appreciate and enjoy them a lot. If there's some of you here that are struggling in any way that we can help you spiritually, we'd like to be able to do that and just help you find a similar kind of peace that Christ can offer for you as well. There's a lot of us here who would be more than willing to speak with you, and if you want, feel free to say something to me about that. There are some resources in Rittman, and maybe more toward the adult level more than anything, but there is an AA group that still meets regularly up at St. Anne's, and it's a very active group, and AA is a great resource for people to use. There's a church on South Main Street. It's the South Main Church of God. They're just across the railroad track, and then on the right-hand side, they're a smaller building. But they do a meeting every Tuesday night. They just started this about a month or two ago. Every Tuesday night for those who are addicted, they want you to come. Bring all your garbage with you. They want to help you there. And that's on Tuesdays at 6 o'clock. And then Calvary Baptist, which is on the opposite side of the schools, just down from the cemetery at DeCourcy and Sunset. Calvary Baptist hosts an Al-Anon on Thursday nights at 7 o'clock. So there are resources around. There are people who care. And we want all to help you as much as we can. So please talk to us. I'm going to have prayer, and then we're going to let you go your different ways. So let's pray together. God, it is always a great thing to hear from you and to see the works of your hand. We see that in the beauty of the earth as we look around and we see the creation and how wonderful it is. And we see it in the new creation of lives that have been transformed because of Jesus Christ and what he's done. Thank you so much for Joe and Jamie. Thank you that they are where they are at now and that you have been a part of that in every step of the way. Thank you for little things like phone calls and waking up and just things that change everything because you really care and you're part of the detail. Lord, we pray for each one here that our hearts would be in tune to you as much as possible, that each one of us would have that personal relationship, the forgiveness that comes from a crucified, risen Savior that has paid for our sins. And help us to understand that more and more and to grow in that and to grow closer to you. Lord, I just thank you for this time, and may Jesus Christ be praised because of it. In his name, amen.